The Cat in the Coup is a simple yet meaningful single player game, which the user controls a black cat that prowls backward through the life of Mohammad Mossadegh, the former Prime Minister of Iran. The design and interactive nature of the game tells the history of Mossadegh as he struggled with relations between Great Britain and the United States in the 1950s over oil disputes. The purpose of the Cat in the Coup is not only to inform, but also to elicit sympathy from the audience for Mossadegh, specifically the Americans and British. More specifically, the organization and gameplay contribute to the plot of the overthrow of Mossadegh by the CIA, while the visual aspects of the game elicit sympathy from the American people, who were largely unaware of the United States'
Initiate
intervention in the
that's
situation.
in
A
this
little
show it was
background.
bigger but
Mossadegh tried to limit the Anglo-Iranian oil company's control over Iran's petroleum reserves, but when the AIOC refused to cooperate, the parliament voted to nationalize Iran's oil industry and thus expel foreign corporate representatives from the country. The result? A worldwide boycott of Iranian oil, followed by Britain's use of Iranian agents to undermine the government. Eventually, it was discovered that Churchill and the Eisenhower administration carried out a coup to overthrow Mossadegh using the CIA. Following the coup in 1953, a government that relied heavily on the United States' support was put in place. Mossadegh, however, was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. This is why the game's intention is to rally sympathy toward Mossadegh after the coup in the 1950s.
At the very beginning of the game, the user sees a black cat as well as Mazadek sleeping in his elaborately decorated room. The player interacts with the game as a black cat, and the game uses white cat outlines to guide the user. When the game starts, Mohammed Mazadek's spirit separates from his body, and the cat then acts as its guide. However, ultimately, the game controls the user because there are only certain locations to which the user can move the cat, and regardless of the user's choices, the outcome of the game is the exact same every time. Because the cat's motion is limited, the player is also limited to one single narrative. Paying closer attention to the background, we see that there is a silhouette of a man behind a window. This perhaps represents the oppressive surveillance that poor old Mossadegh has to live under. As a result, looking at the harsh treatment towards a white-haired, hunchbacked, and helpless Mossadegh, the user can't help but feel sympathy for his situation. Additionally, the background music adds to the gloom and mysteriousness of the game. The song featured in the game is Nasia No. 1 Lent by Eric Satie. Nasia means knowledge in Greek and generally pertains to a deep and mystical insight into the relationship between a man and his spirit, separated from the constraints of his earthly existence. The title of the piece, coupled with its eerie and somber tone in F minor, perhaps suggests the user is delving deep into the psyche of Mossadegh and experiencing a spiritual level of his personal history. All in all, the design of the game acts to create sympathy for Mossadegh's situation as the user experiences the heaviness and misery that characterized his life leading up to his death. Now, the purpose of the game is to guide the user back in time through Mossadegh's story. Playing as the cat, the user indirectly influences Mossadegh's behavior by influencing his surroundings. For example, after the cat spills the ink bottle, Mossadegh chases after the ink bottle and, as a result, walks towards the next room. This in turn progresses the gameplay and thus delivers a documentary of Mossadegh's life. The user's interactions with the game slowly unveil the history behind US-Iranian relations.
Transition into the second room, the black cat lands on a wall surrounding Mossadegh's house, behind what seems to be a pile of books and artwork. A person whose head is replaced with a stack of books appears to be throwing more books into the pile. Upon closer inspection, however, one can see that the artworks are actually shields, used much like riot shields would be. The graphics depict Mossadegh's supporters fighting off the propaganda of the Iranian police of the new reign, using books as knowledge and facts to oppose manipulated information of the current reigning government. The characters land on a stage, a medium which represents how Mossadegh's downfall and humiliation is being broadcast to the public, while also having his fate being placed into the hands of others. With all the propaganda and manipulation of information, he has little control over his future at this point. It also depicts the end of his life, such as a curtain call at the end of a show. This scene illustrates his impending lifelong punishment. The stage has a window in the back where a peacock wearing royal clothing looks in from a window. In the bottom right corner of the screen, a bulldog wearing a top hat with the United Kingdom flag design is accompanied by a toad watching the stage. These characters represent the people and forces that influenced the events of the coup. Based on the history of these events, it can be inferred that the bulldog represents Winston Churchill and the peacock is the Shah. However, the use of the animal heads on their instantly recognizable silhouettes promotes the idea that to Mossadegh their roles were ambiguous. He is unsure of their role in his downfall and whether they were on his side or not, furthering the intention of the audience to pity him. In this scene, the cat must knock over a ball and roll it under Mossadegh to make him fall and break holes in the ground. Once two holes are made adjacent to one another, Mossadegh then falls into the large hole to the next scene. Each time he falls and creates a hole in the ground, it suggests the holes and flaws in the justice system, while Mossadegh can only watch himself struggle to compete against these superpowers that are greedily trying to get rid of him for economic benefit. The creation of a large enough hole for Mossadegh to fall through illustrates how the United States and United Kingdom can easily poke holes in his arguments to support their own agenda. They had to wear him down to a point where he can easily be manipulated to be seen as the antagonist by the masses. The hole in which he falls through underscores his downfall as a result of manipulation and the self-defeating decisions he was forced to make, highlighting yet another burden on Mossadegh which elicits sympathy from the player. The cat playing with the ball further suggests the undermining of justice through the sentencing. The case is compared to a fun pastime for a cat, demonstrating how Mossadegh is being toyed around by these other nations at his expense. Furthermore, the inflated balloon head serves as a metaphor for the CIA feeding manipulated information in events that ultimately resulted in Mossadegh's punishment. The head of the judge, along with the other animal heads of the other figures, are also tools the game creator uses to dehumanize the individuals. By taking away the most human part of the figures, the face, the user is then only able to identify with Mossadegh, the only human character in the entire game. Therefore, the player is pushed to sympathize more with him than any of the other, more antagonistic characters.
After Mossadegh plummets out of the second room, he lands far below next to a wall. There's an image of a pig in a military uniform that is part of a tank being controlled by an American eagle and a British bulldog. The pig is often used as a metaphor of something evil, especially pertaining to war. The American eagle and British bulldog are used to symbolize America and Britain, as well as Truman and Churchill. These leaders are dehumanized, which shows that the creator is in support of Iran. It is also important to note that as Mossadegh falls into this transition between rooms, the audio changes. The American national anthem plays for a moment, and then the sound of chaos and rioting can be heard. The game is making a mockery of America by playing the anthem and riot sounds together, and the game is condemning America for the actions in the coup. This all contributes to the purpose of the game, which is to educate the player about the coup and elicit sympathy for Mohammed Mossadegh. As the player follows Mossadegh on the next stage, we see that this room is labeled August 20th, 1953. Below the room, there's also text that says, Dr. Mossadegh surrenders by phone 24 hours after fleeing mob. It is clear now that the mob sounds represent the angry citizens who have sided with America and Britain in the coup and are attempting to overthrow Mossadegh. These are intimidating sounds, and they put the player in the position that Mossadegh was in. In this room, Mossadegh is sitting on the floor, all alone, looking very distressed with a phone in his hand. This creates an image of helplessness and desperation, which adds to the feeling of compassion the player gets. In this room, the cat must knock objects off the wall and roll them out of the room, but it is difficult because only the door on the elevated side of the room opens. The tilting movement that the player controls acts as a metaphor for the position Mossadegh is in. He must balance everything in his life at the moment and is extremely difficult. Also, both doors won't open at the same time, which shows that Mossadegh can't maintain any kind of compromise. The struggle that the player experiences in this level helps him to understand the struggle that Mossadegh was experiencing at this time. Once an object rolls out of the room, a gray figure catches it and a cash register sound is made. The sound represents capitalism and greed. The figure holds up the object with a look of victory and has a screaming expression on their face. This happens in a savage manner, which illustrates how obsessed people have become with the oil and the money. 4 other gray figures then drop down from the top and begin to push the walls of the room in on Mossadegh. This illustrates how Mossadegh's world is closing in and falling apart. All of these figures show how much people have turned against Mossadegh for their own selfish reasons. Mossadegh is helpless against them, and the player truly feels sorry for him. Once both sides of the room are pushed on Mossadegh, this level is complete.
Mossadegh barely hangs on the phone cord of his own resignation, something no one would want to do after resigning from anything, but he eventually falls to the next scene. The UN flag cannot be ignored as the black cat must land on it. This is meant to symbolize the UN's opposition to Mossadegh's nationalization of the Iranian oil industry. The cat plays witness to Mossadegh crawling like a crippled would out of Big Ben Tower in London, which evokes the reader to feel sorry for Mossadegh's beaten up state by the British oil embargo. Mossadegh drops to the United States Treasury Department as the US tries to mediate Mossadegh's overtaking of the oil industry. Truman's ideology in solving the inevitable Iranian coup was different from that of Winston Churchill and predecessor Dwight Eisenhower. He opposed the United States and United Nations-supported coup. Contrary to the president's desire, the CIA overthrew the Iranian government anyways, which elicits sympathy from the American people and players who overwhelmingly supported Harry Truman at the time. In order to pass the level, one must tip the inkwell to silence Mossadegh. This is important because, as the player, one must scratch and attack Mossadegh just as the United States did to him in order to silence the regime and move him to the next scene.
Mossadegh and the cat fall through an oil funnel to enter the final room of their journey. This room, a giant oil tank sitting above the earth with a hose used to extract the oil, is at the bottom of the vertical map and thus at the very beginning of the reverse timeline of the narrative. Therefore, the room addresses the cost to Mossadegh's degeneration, the oil industry. Right before entering the room, the cat is caught and pet by a bulldog in a British top hat. This is significant as it is the first time that the cat comes in contact with figures other than Mossadegh who happen to be his opponents. Such interaction brings forth the question that has been rising in the player's mind. Is the cat for or against Mossadegh? The cat has helped Mossadegh escape from imminent danger by helping him escape the room, but it did not stop Mossadegh progressing to the next room and toward his downfall. The player only gets to interact with Mossadegh when exiting the room, and the interactions become more direct and violent, which builds up the pity to Mossadegh from the players. The players had to make him trip from a ball and close the walls of the room and drop hot oil on him from a teapot. Now the player has to physically push Mossadegh, a helpless old man, with full force and momentum from top of the chandeliers to puncture holes in the floor. The player as a cat with limited interactivity automatically takes a semi-neutral stance in the gameplay, which reinforces the idea that prevails over the game. One may take a stance but cannot alter the course of history. While the cat is being adored, Mossadegh stealthily opens the old tank valve right under the British bulldog, which illustrates him liberating the oil from Britain's influence. His action is parallel to his attempt to establish democracy by nationalizing Anglo-Iranian oil company to end Britain's exploitation. The setting of the room, more like a parliament hall with lavish decorations, and audio of Mossadegh's speech captures the historical moment around the date and the location labeled by the room. Mossadegh pacing restlessly back and forth shows his anticipation over his decision to cease the unjust relationship between Iran and Britain. The cat or the player cannot calm him down, but can only watch him endure his emotional dilemma. The transition from the room to the ending of the game ties back to Mossadegh opening the oil tank valve in the beginning. It is the only action that Mossadegh took willingly, yet oil brought Mossadegh's demise, and the game reflects on that, for once the oil floods the room, it takes Mossadegh with it. The oil he let run ended up consuming him.
The ending is one of the most important aspects of the game. Here the time stops going in reverse and instead starts from the beginning and progresses throughout the timeline of events until the death of Mossadegh. Up until now, Mossadegh has been going through all of these events helplessly, needing guidance from a black cat, not knowing what was going to happen. This section of the game serves to clear up any misconceptions players may have had by reiterating the events using captions and the reuse of rooms, figures, and decorations. An analysis by students at the University of Southern California eloquently states that to get the player to play the story backwards and comprehend it moving forward honors a recognition that in life we learn history moving back in time, but understanding it forward. The game teaches what happened while playing it, but the ending with forward progression really allows the audience to understand what occurred. They show the story beginning with his election as Prime Minister all the way until his death. Throughout the timeline, Mossadegh floats limply and almost pitifully in oil all the way back up to his body. Along the way, you notice that the animal heads used to depict the United States and Britain are replaced with actual pictures of people and events that occurred. Also, the background of the rooms have changed from wallpaper to actual photographs on which the rooms were based. Beforehand, the animal depictions made it unclear to Mossadegh which side the US was on. Replacing animal heads with real photos shows that now the events have occurred, we know whose side each country is on. It is clearly evident here that poor Mossadegh has been ganged up on by the greater powers in the world. When he finally reaches his body, he continues past and floats up to the unknown afterworld. This clearly emphasizes how oil directly led to his death. It is also important to note that this is the only part within the game that the cat is not a part of. Hence, there is no gameplay. This hands-off part of the game reflects the documentary style of the game and serves the purpose of the creators to inform the audience of the specific event in history. Overall, the creators effectively relay the story of Mossadegh to the audience, especially in a manner that elicits sympathy for the former Prime Minister. By closing the game with Mossadegh floating into the unknown, the creators parallel what happened to him in real life. While he might be known in Iran now, in the United States many people forgot about him or never learned about him. He floated away from history books and lessons.